righty. So just a couple quick announcements. One is that we got email last night from Sweden where people were watching the webcast and saying it was coming through really, really well. So that's exciting for us. And again, thanks to Chris Dowling and to Clark Thompson for making that happen. Also wanted to just thank Cloud Heinz one more time. Probably not the last time, but thank him for making all the technical things work. And also all the volunteers as well. I want to remind you today, of course, many of you aren't here, so you can pass the words to other people, but there's going to be an informal sort of roundtable discussion or community meeting at lunch so people can have a chance to talk a little bit more about what's been going on. Kelly Hargraves has agreed to facilitate that or to sort of moderate it, although it's not, again, it's informal. So that'll be in the parlor, so grab your lunch and, you know, let's put the chairs in a circle or something and spend the time talking about whatever it is that people, that's Kelly right there, people are interested in talking about, issues that are being raised. We're going to try and stay on the clock today, like I said, even though that we're late, so that we can end early and have also the time at the end of the day for discussion that we have planned in the schedule. And then we're getting a map hopefully drawn up to show you how to get to Vilas Hall tonight for the screening, which is just across the street. But it would be nice if everybody knew where it was. It's the, JJ, what floor is Cinematheque on? 4? Okay. Cinematheque's on the 4th floor. But, okay. So what do they push in the elevator?
It's in the middle. It's like a separate room in the middle of the plaza, and if you kind of go to either the main entrance of the building, you won't get into it. It's a little hard to find.
Okay. Well,
it's also in the parliamentary room, so if you get lost, ask somebody, where is the parliamentary room?
okay. And we'll try and put people along the route or something, or rocks or something. Okay, so this is the final day, second day and final day, and I feel, again, honored to have Noel Carroll here to give us his words on the subject that we've been addressing here. Noel has been a real mentor for me for the last 5 or 6 years. So, without any further ado, Noel Carroll.
Thank you. Everyone can hear? I've changed the title of this talk toward a definition of motion picture dance. It's a much less tantalizing title than the original, but I think it gives you a better idea of what I intend to do. I can already hear you groaning, labeling again, how boring, and to a certain extent I agree with you. It's far more interesting to see and talk about new work than it is to classify it. The concrete achievements of the field are more important than abstractions about it. But even though I acknowledge all that, I'm going to persist for 2 reasons. First, as you all probably realize on occasions like this, it's very likely at one time or another that almost everyone here will be tempted to say, or at least whisper to the person next to them, that this or that piece really doesn't belong on the program. So it seems to me a good idea to get the issue out in the open and talk about it abstractly, at least in one session. Second, though defining things can be very tedious, it's also a very powerful way to learn about the contours of a field, because when you attempt to define things and you look at alternative ways of defining it, you come to realize how complex the field really is, since different definitions will highlight certain tendencies of the work in question, even while they obscure others. Definitions, even when they're unsuccessful, as I suspect mine is going to be, can still be illuminating, because definitions don't just tell you the boundary between the field and what's outside of it. They also can reveal the landscape inside the field. So definitions, I think, have a heuristic or pragmatic use. They flush data out. They make complications perspicuous, where heretofore they were ignored, neglected, overlooked, or underappreciated. So I'm sure that my definitions will turn out to be unsatisfactory to some of you, either too narrow or too broad, but I think putting one on the table is the best way to start a discussion. You probably noticed that I've changed the name of the field under discussion to the barbaric-sounding motion picture dance. I think it sounds ugly. If you've got a better suggestion for the idea I'm trying to get, I'm certainly open to it, but for now I can't do any better. I've opted for this way of talking rather than much more familiar ones, such as cine dance, film dance, video dance, camera dance, and even screen dance, which up until a couple of months ago I thought was pretty cool. One way to begin to approach the problem then of defining the field is to try and give the reasons for preferring one nomenclature over another. Traditionally, this area, has been called cine dance or film dance, and I think pretty clearly the problem with calling it this way is that it's too narrow, it's too medium specific. It restricts the phenomena to work made in cinema or film. It's celluloid-based, so to speak. It also, I think, probably belies the modernist bias behind much of the early work in the area. That is, it seems to suppose that each artistic medium has its own particular limitations or potentials, and that it's the duty of the artist to foreground these unique features in the medium, in her work. So many have thought that for a candidate to truly belong to the corpus of cine dance, it would have to exploit the unique features of cinema, where those then are customarily understood in contrast to the possibilities and limitations of theater, including theater dance. Cine dance or film dance, under this construal, is always avant-garde, inasmuch as it's implicitly allied to modernist commitments to the purity of the medium. But this conception is clearly obsolete for two reasons. First, by now, the work that we all agree belongs to the field includes all sorts of work in media other than cinema. Video is the most obvious exception, but also work which no one would deny falls into the category that concerns us can be achieved through computer processing, as Lisa Nogel showed us the other night in her discussion of motion capture, showing us Bill T. Jones' ghost catching. If film was the medium in which endeavors of the kind that concern us first appeared, that I think now can be regarded in one sense as an accident of history. For the visual culture established in the film medium has evolved and been refined by other media, and is likely to undergo even further development in media not yet imagined. This is why, rather than speaking of film studies, I prefer the concept of moving image studies, which includes as its object not only film, TV, video, laserdiscs, and CD-ROM, but also whatever else is to come as future technologies proliferate and generate descendants of our current moving image practices. Similarly, this is why I think we should speak of motion picture dance rather than cine dance, film dance, and for the same reason, video dance, since these categories, insofar as they are each medium-specific, are too restricted. The phenomenon at hand crosses media and should have a label that reflects this. A second reason to avoid media-specific characterizations is related to the implicit modernist prejudices concerning the purity of the medium that often come with this way of speaking. On the modernist conception, a cine dance should be uniquely cinematic or uniquely videomatic. That is, something realizable only in film or video and not by means of some other medium of expression, notably theater. Thus, Tally Beatty's famous leap in Maya Deren's A Study for Choreography for the Camera, a legendary example of Doug Rosenberg's notion of recorporealization, is regarded as the quintessential example of cine dance, for a jeté of that length would be humanly impossible on stage, but is rather an artifact of what might be called film space and film time. Just as to take a video example, Cunningham's Blue Studio would be thought to be something only realizable by video and chroma key. But this modernist bias, I think, is overly exclusive. On the one hand, what's called film space and film time are clearly realizable in other media, including, if not theater, at least video. And on the other hand, it's far from evident that whether something is not realizable theatrically is really the relevant criterion. This approach almost always seems to favor editing and special effects as the true tests for membership in the class of cine dance. But as Roger Copeland pointed out, we may wish to include in the relevant category dances such as numbers by Astaire and Rogers that, though made for the camera, are executed in long-take, deep-focus shots that capture movement in continuous space. Do we wish to exclude these, what might be called Bazinian cine dances, from our perspective, just because it's conceivable they could be staged in real time on the space of a theater stage? Likewise, something like David Woodbury's Invisible Dance, a kind of Tati exercise in discovering dance among the flow of the everyday, could be refashioned as an instance of street theater. But still, the version of Invisible Dance that we possess on film, I think, is something most of us would agree is a cine dance, or at least whatever we wind up calling this category. The same point could be made with respect to Elliot Kaplan and Merce Cunningham's Beats Birds for Camera, since not only is it artistically impure, given its self-avowed painterly ambitions, but also arguably with enough money, enough elaborate set machinery, including rotating stages, and an arsenal of lighting effects, something very like it could be realizable theatrically. And yet, it belongs to the category that concerns us. Of course, by arguing that this category shouldn't be tied to a specific medium, I don't mean an artist should ignore the medium in which she's working, but only that the medium and certain favored uses of it shouldn't be the test of class membership. The artist is well advised to understand the capabilities of her materials, including lenses, film stocks, chroma keys, and the like, which she intends to deploy. The point is simply that which of these materials and their capabilities she chooses doesn't determine whether her work is an instance of what I call motion picture dance. Now, you might think that this dismissal of the importance of the physical medium as a criterion is too hasty. For the notion of a medium can refer not only to materials from which an artwork is constructed, but also to the implement constructing it. Not only sounds, but musical instruments like clarinets can be called musical media. And in this sense, it may seem that everything in the category of motion picture dance does share a medium, an instrument, through whose agency they are all created, and that instrument is the camera. So why not call the category camera dance, or dance for the camera? Now, there are several problems with this. The first is that there are so many different kinds of cameras that one hesitates to call what we've got a single medium. And of course, one can also imagine motion picture dance imagery generated by means of sound, sonograms after the fashion of radar. But as well, in a less science fiction vein, we might worry that thinking in terms of camera dance is too restrictive. Aren't there animated dances which, though they depend on cameras to be mass-produced, are not primarily the result of photography, but of drawing? And would a dance composed exclusively in the realm of CD-ROM by computer animation and exhibited on a computer monitor be discounted from a festival like this because it's not camera-generated? The notion of screen dance, which, as Doug indicated, I once found very promising, may seem to avoid these kinds of problems because it might be supposed that it's not medium specific. Screens are shared by films, video, TV, and computer monitors. But though this may seem perverse on my part, I think that this is false if we take the notion of a screen literally. A screen in the relevant sense is a support on which we project an image. But in this respect, a screen is not a necessary condition for showing even a film. As is well known, Edison originally had the idea that films would be shown at peep shows on devices we would now call moviolas. It remained for the Lumières to project films onto screen. Thus, early dance films like Annabelle the Dancer and Chrissy Sheridan are not examples of screen dance. Moreover, the moviola peep show circuit did not end with the Lumières. From my adolescence, I remember peep shows of exotic dancers and strippers available on coin-operated moviolas in amusement parks and adult bookstores. Now they're videos. I heard they're videos now. Nor were all these films only single-take documentations of prior theatrical performances. Many were edited as well. So films do not need to be screened literally or even to be destined for screening in order to count as films. And so there can even be film dances that are not screen dances. Another problem with the notion of screen dance is that the concept of a screen doesn't really apply to television, though certainly televised dance should not be automatically excluded. Televisual images are not projected onto a screen. We look directly into them. We do not look at their reflections on a screen. Standardly, film scholars attempt to distinguish between film viewing and TV viewing this way. Because of moviolas, I don't think that this distinction is as ironclad as they do, but still, they make a legitimate point about the typical viewing apparatus, that is, rather than, say, the cassette projector. In the usual case, we look into the projection and not at the reflection of a projection. The same can be said about looking at moving images on computer monitors. Denying that TV dances are literally cases of screen dance might strike you as pretty outlandish. After all, we talk about TV screens all the time. But what does this mean? Is the TV screen the front glass on the monitor, the thing that people clean with Windex and sometimes call a screen? But this really isn't a screen properly so called. It's an entirely different animal from a film screen. For first of all, the TV image is projected through this glass, not on it. And second, this glass is not a necessary feature of a TV image. You can take it off and there'll still be a moving image. If you don't believe me, try it. But maybe what people have in mind when they talk about a TV screen is the phosphor screen on the cathode tube. That lies between the shadow mask and the front glass of the picture tube. It's coated with phosphor strips that glow when different colored beams of light hit it. But the phosphor screen is part of the picture tube, which is to say, part of the mechanism. That is, once again, part of the picture tube. It is not a screen onto which an image is projected. It's a device for generating or projecting the image. Typically, there is no screen onto which the projector beam throws an image. In TV, we usually look directly into the projection mechanism rather than at a screen onto which something is projected. Thus, most televised dance, including, for example, Twyla Tharp's making television dance with all its special effects, doesn't literally count as screen dance. I can already hear you complaining. Some of you might say that even if the television screen is not equivalent to a film screen, it's like another kind of screen, namely the wire mesh on a screen door. But if this is how you understand the notion of screen in television screen, then I think you have to admit the category of screen dance is much more heterogeneous than it sounds, since the way in which one applies the concept of film dances versus TV dances is radically different, and in some respects contrary. The locution screen dance thus blurs the important distinctions here and muddies the waters, and this is rarely an admirable tendency when trying to craft a concept. Another complaint some of you may have with this rough treatment of screen dance is that when composing a film dance, a video dance, or a computer dance, you have to be attentive to the dimensions of the picture plane on which you're working. If it's square, or if it's a rectangle, if it's in CinemaScope or Todd AO, the image composer's got to be aware of this, if only to make sure that viewers get to see what they want them to see. And more than that, if you want if you want the images to be genuinely effective, you should study the shape of the visual expanse upon which you're working. And of course, this is all true, but I think it is really to be talking about the frame rather than the screen. It's the frame whose exact dimensions make certain compositions more efficacious than others. For example, with film, we're not actually talking about the surface onto which the image is projected, but the shape of that surface. Likewise, with TV, we're talking about image ratios and their relevance to placing figures saliently inside their borders. Though we may wish to speak of sensitivity to the screen, that's really just a shorthand for referring to framing, whether the framing appears in a phenomenologically deep space or a phenomenologically shallow space. Finally, if you remain unmoved by any of these previous objections, here's another one. The concept isn't well prepared for the future. We can readily imagine holographic dances and dances in virtual reality that we might wish to regard as part of the evolving tradition of motion picture dance, but which will not require screens. And what are the developments we can't foresee? In the future, there may be no screens, yet the practice of motion picture dance may and probably still will be with us. Okay, given these problems with the previous designations, let's try something new. I already mentioned I propose to call the field motion picture dance. This has three components: motion, picture, dance. So, first, in order to belong to this category, an example must be a moving image. This requires that the work in question be made by a technology in which the possibility of movement is at least feasible. Most dances of this sort will either contain figures that are moving or images that elicit the impression of movement by means of devices like fast editing and special effects. Though this covers a lot of ground, some of you might say, well, it's not broad enough, since there are still dances, like Douglas Dunn's 101, and therefore we shall want to count as part of the field's images thereof. But if we make motion the criteria, such efforts will be excluded. This would be a problem if the requirement were that the image had to be moving, but you'll notice the way I stated it, I only required that it had to be made by means of a technology where movement is possible. So a film of a still dance will, so a slide of a film dance won't be counted as a category of the motion picture dance, though a comparable still film, even if it appears perceptually indiscernible from the slide, will count. Is this arbitrary? I don't think so. For in the film case, since movement is a possibility, the fact that the image has no movement is a pertinent stylistic choice. In order to plumb the significance of what an artist has done, we need to ask why she's chosen to make a still image. We need not ask that question about a slide, since movement is necessarily impossible in a slide. If the image could move, it wouldn't be a slide. Movement is not a possible choice with respect to a slide. All slides must be still, so there's no point in asking why the slide is not moving. But if a film shows no movement, that becomes an unavoidable question, since in that case, the artist eschews one of the fundamental possibilities of her medium. So, because of its relevance to artistic choice, style, and significance, the choice of movement versus no movement is a defining feature of film and other forms of moving images, whereas it's not a conceivable choice with respect to slides, or for that matter, paintings, sculptures, and photographs of dance. So that's why I state the motion picture condition so broadly. Of course, most motion picture dances will have movement. Either they're figures or there will be an impression of movement suggested by devices like editing and effects. This is what immediately differentiates them from other visual forms such as paintings, sculptures, and photographs of dance. The notion of motion picture dance also requires that the images be pictures of dance. This, of course, raises the question of what we mean by dance. Richard Lauber attempted to define dance as the sum of all non-functional movement behaviors. That doesn't seem right, however, since the mattress moving in Yvonne Rayner's room service could count as dance movement, but it's functional. Indeed, the exploration of ordinary movement by early postmodern dancers at Judson Church might appear to render the concept of dance utterly open, since if ordinary movement is dance, then it would appear that any kind of movement could be dance. That is, dance couldn't be defined in terms of internal movement properties like expressivity or rhythm. That sounds persuasive, but it doesn't mean that we lack the wherewithal to differentiate dance from other sorts of behavior. Specifically, we may be able to identify something as dance historically, even if we're unable to define it essentially. That is, dance, like the concept of a biological species, may be a historical concept, a concept whose members we determine, as we determine membership in a biological species, by telling narratives or genealogies of their descent. So something counts as a dance movement or dance stillness if it's an example of a historically identifiable dance form or a recognizable descendant thereof. In order to establish that a candidate for membership is dance, you have to establish that it's a recognizable descendant of a previous dance form or combinations of forms. And to do this, you have to tell a narrative of its evolution from bona fide origins, as we do when we explain how postmodern dance evolved dialectically from modern dance. Now, I won't deny that this notion of a historical concept deserves a lot more attention than I've given it, but even a little that's been said should give you at least an inkling of how I propose to tackle the problem of whether or not we're dealing with a specimen of dance. Of course, if you have a better way of identifying dance, you're welcome to use it in the explication of the idea of motion picture dance. At this point, I'm defining an image array as composed of music from of movement from a recognizable dance vocabulary, where a dance vocabulary is identified historically, but if you have a better idea, let's change historically for whatever you'd like to put in that place. This still isn't a complete definition because it's called motion picture dance rather than moving image dance. What, if anything, hangs on this difference between pictures and images? Well, pictures are things whose reference you recognize simply by looking. Pictures are the kinds of things, you find in the world, specific objects, events, persons, and actions. There's a lot of argument that we're sort of hardwired to be able to recognize what we call pictures. It's part of our capacity to recognize objects. As we learn to recognize objects in the world, we also pick up what we need to be able to recognize pictures of objects. Image, on the other hand, is a broader term signifying any form that's visible. An image can be what's called non-figurative or non-objective or abstract. Jackson Pollock, Wesley Kandinsky, and Frank Stella are famous for their images, not for their pictures, since pictures are of recognizable things, or at least recognizable kinds of things, like horses or pigs or cars. Thus, the term motion picture dance narrows the field to visualizations of recognizable things, specifically to dances, which it would seem are necessarily composed of humans or human movement or personifications thereof. So, at least according to me, when I say the concept of motion picture dance describes the field, I'm saying that something belongs in the area just in case it's a moving visual array of recognizably human movement or stillness or personification thereof, drawn from an identifiable existing dance vocabulary or a descendant therefrom, or more simply but less accurately, a motion picture dance is a moving picture of a dance movement. I'm going to call this the central concept of motion picture dance. As we'll see, it needs to be supplemented by another concept, what I'll call the extended concept of motion picture dance. But before we get there, let me say a few things about the central concept. I'm sure you've already formulated objections to the central concept. These objections can take at least two forms. That the notion of motion picture dance, so defined, in certain ways is too narrow, and in other ways it's too broad. For some of you, it's going to be too narrow because it excludes too much, since it excludes what are called ballet mécaniques, like Ferdinand Leger's and Oscar Fischinger's on the one hand, and abstractions like Doris Chase's Circles 1, Rocker, Plexi Radar on the other. Let me say that I hope to deal with these shortcomings with the extended concept of motion picture dance. At the same time, the category may seem too broad, since it includes things like film dance documentations without editing, taken from a fixed camera position, and many of you will argue that that's just not the kind of thing this conference is about. Even the notion of cine dance gets closer to what I'm calling the central concept than motion picture dance. Okay, that's fair, and it calls for some comment. From my perspective, the concept of motion picture dance, as it's been defined so far, only marks the genus of things that concern us. Anything that centrally concerns us must fall into this genus. However, this genus includes several species, notably motion picture dance documentations, motion picture dance reconstructions, and motion picture dance constructions. Now, as these labels indicate, it's probably and primarily motion picture dance constructions that we're gathered here to honor. So the preceding objection is fair to the definition of the genus of motion picture dance, but the damage can be repaired when we categorize the subtending species of the genus and take note that one of them, namely motion picture dance construction, is the category that most interests us. What exactly are these species? Let me say a little about each one. It pays to remember that motion picture dance is a hybridization of two forms, motion pictures and dance. Thus, one way to differentiate the species is to examine the way in which each species relates to two constituents. One relation is that in which the dance is predominant or the lead element, where the motion picture subserves the dance element. That's motion picture documentation. Another possibility is where the motion picture component calls the tune. That's motion picture construction. Between the two, there's the possibility where motion picture elements and dance elements are co-equal determinants in the result. Motion picture reconstruction fills that category. Let me try and be a little less abstract and say something about each of the categories. Motion picture documentations take advantage of technologies like cinema and video in order to imprint records of the past chemically, mechanically, and or electronically in their medium. Documents of this sort are invaluable to dance historians and choreographers involved in reconstituting the classics. They supply a temporal telescope into dance history. Traditionally, the preferred style of these documents is a frontal, long-take, single, fixed camera position approach. And examples would include Virginia Brooks's 1983 video of the Dayton Contemporary Dance Company at the Riverside Festival, Tally Beatty's 1948 dance piece from Jacob's Pillow, and the documentation of the version of Li Xiaoping's Yellow River that she screened here yesterday. I have a long section on why notators don't like documents, but I'm going to skip that. You'll be happy to know the documenters do better than the notators. Or maybe you won't be happy to know that. Let's go to the next category. If in the case of motion picture dance documentations, the motion picture component is in the service of the dance, in the case of motion picture dance reconstructions, I think Li Xiaoping used the word translations when where I'm using the word reconstructions. So you shouldn't confuse my use of reconstructions with the choreographer's notion of reconstruction, such as reconstructing the rite of spring. What I'm calling a reconstruction is the use of motion picture to present a dance in the repertoire, not just to necessarily remount a dance long forgotten. So if in the case of motion picture dance documentation, the motion picture component is in the service of the dance, in the case of motion picture dance reconstructions, the dance component and the motion picture component are more like co-contributors to the result. The point of a dance reconstruction is to make the dance and its qualities accessible to a viewer. To this end, the reconstructor will deploy camera positions, editing, close-ups, and the like in order to recreate the impression of the dance. Examples I have in mind include productions of Dance in America, such as the reconstruction of Western Symphony in the 1993 production of Balanchine Celebration Part 2 by Matthew Diamond. In these cases, I suggest the motion picture dance reconstruction is to be understood as an interpretation of an already existing dance or an already existing performance of an already existing dance. Maybe a useful analogy here is with musical performance. Just as musical performers perform what we call an interpretation of an already existing work, so motion picture dance reconstructors, employing her complement of visual resources, makes an interpretation of a pre-existing dance or dance performance, where the dance performance is already an interpretation. The aim of musical performance is to make the musical work accessible to an audience. Likewise, the motion picture reconstructor aims at making a pre-existing theatrical performance of dance accessible to an audience by, in effect, showing them how and where to look at a pre-existing dance and how to organize the dance and its important patterns in their temporal experience. In effect, the motion picture dance reconstruction is an interpretation of an interpretation, where the pre-existing performance is itself generally an interpretation of a pre-existing dance. Moreover, just as there can be many acceptable performative interpretations of the same piece of music, there can be many different, though acceptable, motion picture dance reconstructions of the same dance, each in turn making different aspects of the dance accessible to viewers. In motion picture dance reconstructions, the dance component and motion picture component are co-equal in the sense that though the reconstruction is constrained to be beholden to respecting the identity of the dance, the desired result is to render the dance accessible visually and orally in a motion picture format, thereby requiring that the dance be adjusted to the exigencies of the pertinent motion picture mode of representation. This will often require interrupting or reorienting the movement of the dance in a battery of takes for maximal camera exposure. Motion picture dance reconstruction requires a tender balance between the choreographer and the reconstructor, but it is not an impossible one to achieve. Whereas the reconstructor is involved in remounting a past dance via motion pictures, the motion picture dance constructor is aiming to produce a new work. To see what I'm getting at, it's useful to begin by recalling the modernist notion of cine dance. There, the idea was that a cine dance is made for the screen and that the way to test for success is to ask whether the dance could be realizable by theatrical means. Where it is, that's taken as evidence, where it isn't, that's taken as evidence that a new work has been created, one that relies essentially on the camera for its provenance. So work like Hilary Harris's 9 Variations is a paradigmatic cine dance in this tradition, since it supposed that its penetrating geography of the body is not something obviously realizable on stage, dependent as it is on close-ups and framing. Now, I've criticized this modernist bias, saying that comparable theatrical realizability shouldn't be the test of whether something counts as a motion picture dance, but there is a piece of the notion of cine dance that's still of use, I think, namely that such a construction must be a new work, one brought into being and shaped by the agency of the resources of the motion pictures, such as editing, camera placement, movement, special effects, digital processing, movement capture, computer animation, and the like. This doesn't mean that a motion picture dance constructor can't use pre-existing dance material, as I suspect Hilary Harris did, in the process of constructing something new by cinematic agencies. It only requires that the constructor be attempting to produce a new dance in the process rather than documenting or reconstructing one. Speaking of her work with Douglas Rosenberg entitled Delo, Li Chaoping put the point nicely when she said that Delo was not a translation of a work, but rather was the work. So the test of whether we have a motion picture dance construction is whether the constructor intends to produce an autonomous work using either pre-existing dance material or dance material expressly composed for interacting with whatever motion picture resources the constructor has at her disposal. On this construal, it makes no difference if a comparable dance work could be realized by other means, such as theater. What makes the difference is that the new work in question was in fact produced through the agency of motion pictures, for example, by cinematic or videographic means. This implies, moreover, these means, moreover, need not be unique to the relevant medium. Thus, a long-take duo by Astaire and Rogers composed for the camera, though perhaps in some sense realizable on a stage, still counts as motion picture constructions because it is a new work, a new dance, brought into existence by the agency of motion pictures. The issue isn't whether or not the new work could have been produced in another art form, but whether it was brought into existence by the art form of motion pictures. So far, I've defined the genus of motion pictures and divided it into 3 subspecies, to which the last, motion picture dance construction, is undoubtedly the one we most care about, since it's the source of original works in this field. I claim this is the central concept of motion picture dance, because most of the work that one will encounter at festivals like this fall into this genus, and as well, one can expect to find examples of all 3 species on its programs. Though, of course, one expects to find more motion picture dance construction than other sorts, nevertheless, when some documentations or reconstructions appear, one is unlikely to hear too much grumbling, since, I think, all 3 species coincide with our intuitions roughly about what fits naturally into the field of interest. That is, we all understand why documentations, reconstructions, and constructions have found their way onto the program. But even if the formulations suit the least controversial examples, they don't cover everything. As previously indicated, by requiring that motion picture dances be comprised of dance material, however straightforward that makes the categorization, it fails to accommodate ballet mechaniques and non-figurative movement abstractions that are also often regarded as part of the tradition. In order to deal with cases like this, I suggest we introduce the second concept, which I'll call the extended rather than the central concept of motion picture dance. This, of course, involves the presupposition that the field is really governed by 2 concepts, not one concept. The central concept needs to be supplemented by the extended concept. What's the extended concept? Well, here's my proposal. Something is a motion picture dance in the extended sense if the image component includes a significant amount of movement presented because it's interesting for its own sake. This movement may be of elements inside the frame or the impression of movement generated by technical means like editing. Where that movement is interesting in its own right, we have a case of motion picture dance in the extended sense. For in these cases, we are apt to describe the movement as dance-like, just because dance is the art form that specializes in the exhibition of movement for its own sake. That's not all dance does, of course, but when asked which of all the art forms specializes in the exhibition of movement for its own sake, dance seems the likeliest candidate. That is, dance is the pre-existing category under which we subsume movement presented because of its intrinsic interest as movement. Consequently, when we encounter a motion picture that exhibits a significant amount of movement in a way that's interesting for its own sake, we're naturally inclined to say that it is dance-like, or, in my terminology, an instance of motion picture dance in the extended sense. Here, I hasten to add that a set of movements may not only be interesting for its own sake, but interesting for other reasons as well. Thus, the aerial ballets in Bruce Lee's Kung Fu films, what Douglas Rosenberry calls recorporealization, are narratively interesting at the same time they are interesting, indeed delightful, to watch for their own sake. My requirement is simply that the movement be at least interesting for its own sake, but it need not be exclusively so. Because as well as being interesting in its own sake, Bruce Lee's martial cinematography is also interesting for narrative reasons. We can call it a case of motion picture dance in the extended sense for this reason. Furthermore, if you accept the notion of motion picture dance in the extended sense, we can deal with the kinds of cases the central concept leaves out. Ballet mécaniques present non-human movements as interesting for their own sake. Abstract movement pieces can also be counted as motion picture dance in the extended sense, where they picture movement that is interesting for its own sake. Even constructions comprised of ordinary movement, such as Amy Greenfield's Tides, and the selections we saw from Sylvanus Sperling's bilingual duetto and Amy Skonberg's warm-up etude, count as motion picture dance in the extended sense if the ordinary movement is exhibited in the context of a new artwork in a way that renders it interesting for its own sake. Now, if we employ these two concepts, the central concept and the extended concept, I think we can assimilate all the cases of dance-relevant motion pictures we want. Is there a problem with employing two concepts rather than one? Well, perhaps some of you worry that there is because you fear that one concept, the central concept, is being implicitly privileged hierarchically over the other. But there's no reason to suppose that this must be the case. It's perfectly consistent with what we've said so far, that many motion picture dances in the extended sense are superior to motion picture dances more centrally in the category, including motion picture dance constructions. Indeed, none of my categories are evaluative, or at least they're not meant to be. They're all supposed to be classificatory. A well-done motion picture dance reconstruction, I think, can be aesthetically better than a lackluster or inept motion picture dance construction. In conclusion, I've developed this family of definitions that are designed to capture the range of things I believe we intuitively feel drawn to include in the corpus of what I'm now calling motion picture dance, a label that I at least believe encompasses the extension of things that gatherings like this are about. Some of you I know have genuine anxieties about definitional projects like this because you feel that definitions, like Aristotle's definition of tragedy, have a tendency to turn into prescriptions, attempts by theorists to legislate what will count as art or art of a certain genre, like motion picture dance. But I don't think this definitional exercise has been legislative, because the framework I've just offered is rather compendious, since even if the central concept limits experiments to dance movement, the extended concept opens to any kind of movement. This allows that anything can be grist for the artist's mill, so long as it has something to do with the possibility of movement. Can any conception be more liberal? Does anyone wish to include in the category something that has nothing whatsoever to do with movement? In any case, my definitions aren't overly exclusive from the artistic point of view, since, of course, even if someone makes a work that somehow falls outside this framework, there's no implication in what's been proposed that it can't be a work of art or that it can't be something of great value. So what's the problem? I'm sure you'll tell me. Doug, is there time for questions? Yeah. Questions, objections, comments, anything you'd like? Oh, okay, great.
I worry about some sort of ghettoization of our work in that field, and when do I fall in and out of dance and going more into that field, and there's incredible prejudice, I think, on both sides, and now I have to look at it as sides rather than as a continuum. So, and that brings me to the next thing, which is, you know, things that fall into your definition, not the things that fall out of it. But to me, that includes almost every picture, movement, film I've ever seen, you know, because I have a very wide definition of what dance is and a very wide definition of what choreography is. So then that brings me to kind of a third thing, this word choreography in relationship to this, but mainly my main question or desire to hear talked about a little bit is the experimental video and film world and how that relates to a lot of this work, which I see as essentially experimental.
I think you're raising an important issue, and one aspect that I think it makes it difficult to talk about, given the history of the conversation in this area, is that I think, as I suggested, and I think Doug suggested this too, probably when the area was born in at least one kind of moment of high modernism, and that's why the cine dance discussion is wedded to a century-long discussion about the purity of the medium. And of course, at that point in time, that was allied to at least a tradition in avant-garde filmmaking that shared those kinds of requirements. I think in terms of some of the new material that we see at conferences and symposiums like this, and some things we saw last night and stuff that everybody knows about, is probably more allied to avant-garde film and video in, I suppose, what you'd call a more postmodernist or anti-modernist vein that mixes a lot of text, direct camera declamation, and once you give up the constraints of purity on both the dance side and the image side, then you feel like you're amidst the vast identity crisis. I mean, modernism at least enabled you to stay on a kind of even keel, and I suppose in some ways I have avoided that. I mean, I've tried to handle it in my definitions by using two different concepts, one that's weak on the camera side and the other that's weak on the dance side, to be as incorporative as possible. But I think maybe what you're saying is, can you talk more directly? And I guess my first response is to say that that probably is an issue that should be addressed more directly, rather than continuing on as if it's all exactly the same thing. About the problem of, so I think there is a less acknowledged relation to contemporary avant-garde film and video that has to do with an eschewal of that kind of modernist purism. But that in turn makes the way to proceed in the discussion difficult. In terms of being too inclusive, well, I mean, it is true. You're right. I mean, I said the movement has to be interesting for its own sake. Now, to be in the extended concept, and your worry is that's going to include everything. And I sort of know people who say that. The late Hollis Frampton used to tell me things like that. But I think for most of us, most of this stuff we see on the screen, the movement isn't interesting for its own sake. It's very functional. Sometimes it's barely watchable on the news. So although I admit we'd have to spend more time talking about how you go about telling whether or not something is interesting for its own sake, I guess I'm not so worried, because I think it will be doable, because it seems to me there is an awful lot of movement that isn't interesting for its own sake. But if you're an omnivorous lover of movement, like Stan Brakhage and Hollis Frampton, you're not going to be able to make this difference. I mean, you believe everything is wonderful. Since I think that sometimes they're posing when they claim to say they never met a movement they didn't like, I think things aren't so bad.
Maybe Noel can join us at lunchtime.
First of all, thank you. It was really beautifully constructed, the whole thing. But I think it's part of my contrary personality that I get attracted to the gray areas between things. So if we can talk about the species level, you've done a nice job of naming three sort of organizing concepts within that. But when I look at the fuzzy areas between them, it gets interesting to me. Documentation, as you've described it, is almost non-existent as I know it. Because to me, as soon as you put two cameras on a dance and begin to have to edit back and forth, you've already entered into the area of reconstruction. So that's one fuzzy area. And then the other one, going between the reconstruction and the construction, smacks of intentional fallacy a bit to me, because I can see an argument between a choreographer and a filmmaker about whether this is a new piece or a reconstruction of an existing piece based on material that may have already existed in some way. Can you just talk a bit on that?
Yeah. Actually, both of the issues are things that that I did try to address, but in sections I skipped over. The issue about, I said that I sort of took on some complaints of notators. I mean, notators' complaints about documentations. Notators often say, well, you know, the documenter is in a dilemma. Either they edit, in which case, as you suggest, there's the worry that the document has been doctored, or they stand back to get the whole dance and they miss details, qualities, whatever. So these animals are impossible. They don't do what they're supposed to do. And so what I did in that section, which probably maybe I didn't read it because I didn't think I stood a chance, but I tried to suggest, look, the notator or those worries come from thinking about one style of documentation, which, you know, is the perversive style. You put the camera back in an ideal audience position and you record it in a single take. And once you've done that, you look like, you know, you've missed a lot of detail. But if you start cutting and moving the camera around, then we no longer have the work in all its integrity. But what I suggested is maybe people have, and you know, for good reason, because there's not an incredible amount of money around to document every piece, but maybe people are thinking about one style of documentation rather than what has to be. For example, the notator complains you're always stuck with one performance by one performer, so you can't tell the dancer from the dance because you've got the mannerisms of the dancer. Well, of course, you could do something where you include alternate performances by different dancers. And, you know, you can imagine different ways of organizing this. It doesn't have to be sequentially. You could put it in appendices in the back, or you could put it in hypertext on a CD-ROM, and you could access all kinds of alternatives. So on the one hand, you could have the piece in its integrity end to end, but also you could have variations. You can also have details the way Sally Baines and Robert Alexander had in their reconstruction of Trio A. Or you could slow the dance down in the appendices, the way Babette Mangold does in her version of Water Motor. And there's a Doris Humphrey reconstruction, maybe somebody... Two static themes, okay. Where actually it's straight through with two different casts. I mean, and there are lots of ways to solve these problems. You can have insets into images, split screens, hypertext. So I think there's a way to solve the dilemma of either doctoring it by using more than one camera or excluding it by missing detail by using just one camera. That's probably an overly long answer to your first question. About the intentional fallacy, I never believed it was a fallacy. I mean, I think especially when we try and fix the category that an artwork belongs to, we have to make reference to intentions. Just a simple example. We talk about irony or put things in the category of irony. Now, in the case of irony, when somebody